Have you ever sat quietly in the early hours, maybe with a cup of tea warming your hands, and wondered when life got so heavy? Not in the dramatic sense, but in that quiet, soul-deep kind of way. The way a coat wears out, not from a single storm, but from years of silent weathering. The kind of weight that doesn't shout, but lingers in your shoulders, in your breath, in the pause you take before answering, "I'm fine." Maybe you've carried it so long that you forgot when you picked it up. Or maybe you just told yourself, like so many of us do, that's just life. There's a story I once heard from a monk in the northern hills of Chiang Mai. He told of an old farmer who came to the monastery with a heart full of worry. His crops had failed, his sons no longer spoke to him, his knees ached every morning. He said to the monk, "I came here so you can help me fix my problems." The monk smiled kindly, not with pity, but with something like compassion seasoned by time. "I cannot do that," he said, "but I can teach you how to carry them differently." That story sat with me, and maybe it sits with you now, because most of us were never taught how to carry life's load without letting it shape our bones. We inherited this idea somewhere along the way, that strength means silence, that resilience means enduring without pause, and that admitting we're tired somehow means we've failed. But what if we've misunderstood what strength truly is? Stress, we're told, is the enemy, something to fix, something to eliminate. But that's like calling the wind a mistake because it blows too hard on some days. Stress, in its essence, is life rubbing up against itself. It's a message, not a punishment. And sometimes it's simply our body whispering that it's been too long since we listened. I remember visiting my grandfather not long before he passed. He'd spent his life working on ships, calloused hands, a back shaped by the ocean's rhythm. He was a man of few words, but that day, sitting on the porch as the sun fell behind the hills, he said, "I used to think I had to hold everything up, the job, the family, my own damn pride. Turns out, what I really needed was to learn how to set it down from time to time." He laughed, almost surprised by his own truth. "And no one taught me that part." In Buddhist teaching, there's a saying, dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more precisely, the unsatisfactoriness of clinging to what must change, not the pain itself, but the grip. And so much of our stress comes not from what is happening, but from the stories we tell about it. From trying to force calm when we feel chaos, from pretending we're okay when really all we want is someone to sit quietly beside us and say, "Me too." We live in a world that praises productivity but forgets presence, that tells us we're only valuable if we're useful, fast, efficient. But here's the quiet truth. You are not a machine. You are not behind. You are not broken because you feel broken. You are alive, and being alive means being tender sometimes, even tired, even undone. Have you noticed how even trees bend in the wind, and still they remain rooted? No shame in bending, no shame in being moved. The shame perhaps is in believing you must always be still. A dear friend once told me a story from his own retreat. He had gone to a mountain monastery after a period of deep burnout. The first morning during walking meditation, he was so focused on doing it right, on counting breaths, adjusting posture, keeping the right pace, that he missed the whole walk. It wasn't until a monk, smiling, gently tapped his shoulder and said, "You can stop trying so hard now, just be here." That moment broke something open in him, and in time, something softer grew in its place. How many of us are walking through life like that, holding our breath while trying to breathe properly, doing life like a performance, even the parts that were supposed to restore us? I ask you gently, what would it feel like to let go of the pressure to hold everything perfectly? What if you no longer had to be the one who keeps it all together? What if softness was not a failure, but the beginning of your healing? In a world that celebrates hard edges, gentleness is a quiet rebellion. And maybe that's where our true strength lies, not in resisting stress, but in changing how we relate to it. Because if we start to listen, truly listen, we might find that stress isn't the problem. Our resistance to feeling it is. And so we begin. This journey isn't about fixing you. You're not broken. It's about meeting yourself with all your weathered places and saying, I see you. Let's walk a little more lightly now. And as we begin to lift that first layer of weight, let's gently step forward into the next part of our reflection, where we'll look at what it really means to be strong and whether that version of strength has truly served us or simply made us tired. There's a strange kind of pride many of us carry, one we rarely speak aloud but feel pulsing beneath the surface. It whispers, "You don't get to stop. Not yet." It was passed down to us not in words but in glances, in tightened jaws, in the silent endurance of those who came before us. Your father who never cried, even when life unraveled. Your mother who held 10 things at once and never dropped a single one, at least not where anyone could see. Somewhere along the way, we confused strength with silence and resilience with never bending. But have you ever asked yourself, what did that silence cost? There's a tale from the Buddhist canon about a monk named Sona. He was diligent, so much so that he would walk back and forth on the monastery path until the soles of his feet bled. He thought effort alone would lead to liberation. But the Buddha, seeing his struggle, approached him gently one day and asked, "Sona, were you a musician in your past life?" The monk nodded, surprised. "Yes, I played the lute." The Buddha continued, "Tell me, does the lute make sound when the strings are too tight?" "No, Lord." "And does it make sound when the strings are too loose?" "No, Lord." "Then only when the strings are tuned just right does it play?" Sona bowed his head. "Yes, Lord." The Buddha smiled. "Then walk your path like you would tune your lute, not too tight, not too loose." And just like that, the lesson landed. How many of us are walking our path with strings pulled far too tight, driven by ideas of what we're supposed to be, strong, dependable, unshakable, until one day something cracks and we don't know how to loosen without falling apart. When I was younger, I thought strength was about holding the most without showing it. I remember my uncle, a man whose laugh could fill a room but who never once spoke of his pain. When his wife passed, he wore his grief like armor, silent, polished, invincible. But years later, I saw him weep, not in a moment of defeat, but in surrender. And there was something beautiful in that moment, something holy even. His strength didn't break that day, it softened, and in softening, it became more real. We've been told to be diamonds under pressure, that the more weight we carry, the more we shine. But that's not always true. Diamonds may not break, but people do. And unlike gemstones, our hearts need tending. They need pause, they need softness to survive. There's a quiet myth stitched into the fabric of our culture, that the more we do, the more we are. But I've come to believe that true resilience isn't built in the doing, but in the being, in the ability to say, "This is enough for now," in recognizing that resting is not quitting, that asking for help is not weakness, that crying in the dark might be the bravest thing we ever do. And perhaps you've lived long enough to start sensing it too, that the stories we were handed about toughness, about pushing through, were incomplete. They taught us how to endure, yes, but not always how to heal. They taught us how to keep going, but not how to come home to ourselves. So let's rewrite that script, shall we? Let's say that strength is the grandmother who finally lets herself nap at noon because she's tired, not lazy. That resilience is the man who walks slower now, not because he's weak, but because he finally has the wisdom to notice the trees. Let's say that it takes courage to slow down, that it takes maturity to say, "I don't need to be everything for everyone anymore," because you don't. I know there's guilt that comes with that. For many of us, slowing down feels like betrayal, like we're letting someone down. But the truth is, your value was never in how much you could carry. It was always in your presence, your attention, your ability to love, and none of that depends on being strong in the way we once believed. A Buddhist master once said, "The oak tree is strong, but it falls in the storm. The reed bends with the wind, and so it survives." Which one do you want to be now, in this chapter of life? Because there is no prize for exhausting yourself into silence. There is no trophy for the cleanest suffering. There is only this breath, this moment, this chance to tune your strings a little looser, to let your body rest into itself, and to begin practicing a new kind of resilience, one rooted not in hardness but in grace. And so as we begin to unravel that myth of strength, a new understanding arises, one that invites us to look deeper at the types of stress we carry. Because not all stress is the same. Some of it builds us, yes, but some of it corrodes quietly beneath the surface. So how do we tell the difference? And more importantly, how do we respond? Let's continue, and I'll meet you there. You know, it's easy to think of stress as one single looming cloud, just this dense grey weight hanging over our lives. But truth be told, not all storms are the same. Some bring the rain that feeds the earth, others bring lightning that scorches. And just the same, not all stress is born of the same seed. Some of it stirs us awake, some of it steals our peace without a sound. There's a phrase I once heard from a forest monk: "Fire is neither good nor bad, it depends on whether it warms your home or burns it down." That idea has never left me, and I offer it to you now because I wonder, can you tell the difference between the kind of stress that fuels your growth and the kind that's quietly eating you from the inside out? One of the great teachings in Buddhist psychology is the distinction between wholesome and unwholesome states of mind, not in a moralistic sense, but in terms of what leads to clarity, openness, compassion, and what leads to contraction, confusion, suffering. We can think of stress in a similar way. There's a kind of stress that arises from something meaningful, a new role in life, a fresh challenge, stepping outside your comfort zone to help someone you love. That kind of stress, what scientists now call adaptive stress, often feels difficult but somehow alive. It's the flutter in your chest before giving your first speech, or the weariness of caring for a new grandchild. It stretches you. Yes, but in stretching, it makes you wider, more aware, more connected. But there's another kind, and it's quieter, stickier. It creeps in, then lingers like humidity in the walls. That's the stress that arises from being out of alignment with your needs, your values, or your truth. When you say yes while your heart pleads no, when you smile politely while your chest tightens, when you tell yourself, "I should be grateful," even as something deep inside you is shrinking. That's maladaptive stress, not because you're weak, but because you've been too strong for too long in the wrong direction. I once met a woman named Helen at a retreat in Oregon. She was in her 70s, soft-spoken, with eyes that had seen decades of holding things together. We sat under the trees during lunch, and she said something I'll never forget. "I raised 3 kids, held a job for 40 years, kept the house, cared for my mother, cooked every dinner, but I didn't know I was allowed to be tired." She paused, then looked at her hands. "I thought I was supposed to be grateful, and I was, but I was also drowning." What she was describing wasn't a lack of gratitude, it was the cost of chronic misaligned stress. The kind where your life looks fine from the outside, but inside, something is quietly unraveling. The kind of stress that doesn't shout, but leaves you feeling like you're living life with the volume turned down on joy, and the body knows, even when the mind denies. You may feel it in your digestion, your sleep, your breath that sits too high in your chest. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not just from pain, but from clinging to identities, roles, expectations. And so many of us, especially as we grow older, carry roles that no longer serve us: the fixer, the rock, the one who always says yes. So here's a question worth sitting with. What are you holding on to that once protected you but now exhausts you? Stress, when left unexamined, can become part of our identity. We say, "I'm just a worrier, I've always been this way." But who would you be without that story? What would open up if you believed that it was safe to let go of the unnecessary suffering? Now, I'm not saying that life will suddenly be easy. Of course not. Pain still visits, life still surprises, but the difference is in how we meet it. When stress arises from living in accordance with your heart, even when it's hard, it comes with a quiet dignity, a sense of purpose, a kind of nobility. But when it comes from betraying your own rhythm, day after day, it leaves a residue. That residue, if we're not careful, becomes bitterness. And I know you've met people who carry that, right? Maybe you've even felt it brush against your own skin at times. Bitterness isn't a flaw, it's grief that never got a voice, and often it grows where misaligned stress goes unspoken. The good news is, it's never too late to shift. Even now, no matter your age, you can begin to tell the difference between a fire that warms and a fire that burns. You can ask yourself with tenderness, does this challenge make me more alive or more afraid? Does this effort expand me or slowly erase me? The answers won't always be immediate. Sometimes they arrive as a feeling in the gut or a softness in the chest when you hear the truth. But they do come, especially when we slow down long enough to listen. And when we begin listening, really listening, another realization dawns. The stress we carry is not just emotional, it's physiological. It changes how our brain functions, how we think, how we react. It turns the wise into the reactive, the spacious into the constricted. So how do we work with that? How do we meet the body with compassion when it too is tired? Let's step into that space next, where science meets stillness, and begin learning how stress shapes the aging mind, and how even then it can be gently rewired. There's a kind of quiet betrayal that happens in the body when stress stays too long. It doesn't announce itself in big dramatic ways at first. It whispers, a little tension in the neck that never leaves, a sense of fog that creeps into the mind, a breath that never quite feels full. Maybe you've noticed it too, how your thoughts loop more often than they used to, or how small things startle you more easily. You forget what you were going to say mid-sentence. You walk into a room and pause, just to remember why you're there. And then comes the self-blame. I'm slipping. I must be getting old. But what if the truth is gentler and more hopeful than that? You see, under chronic stress, your brain changes, not because you're broken, not because you're aging poorly, but because your nervous system is trying desperately to keep you alive in a world it thinks is dangerous. It doesn't know the difference between a tiger in the jungle and a stack of unpaid bills. It doesn't distinguish between the deep grief of loss and the shallow anxiety of an overflowing to-do list. To your brain, threat is threat, and so it shifts into survival mode. That mode is governed by the amygdala, the part of your brain that scans constantly for danger. Useful, certainly, when we needed to run from wild animals, but not so helpful when the tigers are traffic, deadlines, or family conflict. When the amygdala takes over, it pulls energy away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for memory, reflection, patience, and big-picture thinking. In other words, the very part you most need to navigate life with calm and clarity gets dimmed while the alarm bells ring on repeat. The Buddhists speak often of vigilance, but not the kind that keeps us frozen in anxiety. Instead, they teach mindful awareness, a gentle turning toward experience without flinching or fleeing, a knowing, not a panicking. And I wonder, what would shift for you if, when stress rose, you could meet it not with urgency, but with curiosity? I remember speaking with an old man named Miguel during a mindfulness group I led years ago. He was in his late 60s, recently retired and struggling with memory lapses that scared him. "Sometimes I go blank mid-thought," he told me, eyes lowered, "and I start to think, maybe I'm disappearing." He had spent a lifetime providing, working 2 jobs, raising 4 children, caring for a sick spouse. He never stopped, not once. "I thought I was just doing what needed to be done," he said, "but now I think maybe I was surviving more than I was living." We practiced something simple together. I asked him to place one hand on his chest and one on his belly, to breathe slowly, deeply, like pouring water into a bowl. We sat like that for 5 minutes in silence. When he opened his eyes, they were soft. "That felt like coming home," he whispered. You see, the breath is not just a poetic symbol in Buddhist practice. It's a physiological key. It's the only function in the body that can be both automatic and intentional. Which means, when you choose to breathe slowly, to deepen your inhale and lengthen your exhale, you send a message to your body: we're safe, you can rest now. And slowly, with practice, the brain begins to trust that message. Neuroplasticity, once thought to be a youthful trait, continues well into old age. The brain, like the heart, is resilient when met with kindness. It can rewire, it can soften, it can change, even now. But change doesn't mean doing everything differently. It means starting with something simple, like a pause, like this very moment, just stopping for one breath and noticing, here I am. This is why the monks often teach the practice of stop, breathe, be. It sounds so simple that many overlook it, but simplicity is not the same as smallness. In fact, simple things are often the most profound, especially when practiced deeply. Stop, not forever, not dramatically, but just for now. Stop doing, stop striving. Let the world keep spinning without you, just for a moment. Breathe, not to fix, not to force. Simply inhale through the nose, slow and full, then exhale through the mouth, soft and long. Let your shoulders drop with the breath. Be. No need to analyze, plan or judge. Just exist in this body, in this space, with this breath, and notice the world hasn't fallen apart. In fact, maybe it's held together by exactly this kind of stillness. These tiny pauses are not insignificant. They are medicine for a body long trapped in reactivity. They are the beginning of a different relationship with your stress, one based not in fear, but in presence. And from presence, something beautiful becomes possible. Gratitude, not forced, not fabricated, but real gratitude, the kind that arises when the noise quiets and we notice the miracle in the mundane. A warm cup, a morning breeze, the sound of a bird that's been singing outside your window for years, unnoticed. So before we move on, take a breath with me, right now, in, out, and now let's step softly into that space of remembering how to see the good again, how to practice gratitude, not as a task, but as a doorway to resilience, to balance, to peace. It's a funny thing. Gratitude, so often it's portrayed as a kind of sugary optimism, the stuff of greeting cards and well-meaning advice. Just be grateful, people say, as if it were a switch you could flip when life feels like it's caving in. But the kind of gratitude we're speaking of here, it's deeper. It's not about pretending things are fine, it's about noticing what remains, even when they're not. There's a Zen saying, after the ecstasy, the laundry, which is to say, enlightenment doesn't float above real life, it's embedded in it, in the folding of sheets, in the creak of old floorboards, in the aching knee that reminds you you're still here. And so too is gratitude. It's not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to turn toward life, again and again, with open eyes. I remember a woman I met in a meditation group, Anne, in her early 70s, freshly widowed. She'd been married over 40 years. Her grief was thick and tender, the kind that wraps around you in silence. During one session, she shared that the mornings were the hardest. "I still make 2 cups of coffee," she said, eyes glossy. "Then I remember, and the air feels heavy." We talked, softly, about creating space not to replace grief, but to sit with it differently. I invited her to begin a small practice, not to deny her pain, but to soften her gaze around it. Each morning, before the coffee, she would write down 5 things she was grateful for. But not just the things, also why. That part mattered. Weeks passed. Then one day she arrived with a glow in her cheeks I hadn't seen before. "This morning," she said, "I wrote the sound of the coffee percolating, because it reminds me I still have ears. I wrote the emptiness of his chair, because it shows me how deeply I loved." That's what real gratitude does. It doesn't bypass sorrow. It leans into it with warmth. It reframes the landscape, not to erase the dark hills, but to help us notice the light resting on their edges. In Buddhism, this is close to the practice of mudita, appreciative joy. It's not just being grateful for what's easy or pleasant. It's finding a quiet gladness in things just as they are, the breath that returns without being asked, the warmth of a sweater, the miracle of digestion, the way the sky never asks anything of us but always keeps showing up. And the science, as it turns out, agrees. Research on the brain shows that intentional gratitude practices, especially when written down, can shift the default mode of the mind. They reduce the hold of the amygdala, that old fear center. They light up parts of the brain associated with contentment, empathy, and connection. Over time, it's not just your outlook that changes, it's your wiring. But let's be honest, when you're tired or overwhelmed or just going through the motions, starting a gratitude practice can feel silly, forced. And that's okay. You don't need to start big. You don't need to feel anything profound. You just need to begin. Write one thing, a moment, a detail. The way the cat sat on my lap this morning. How the toast smelled just right. The call I almost didn't answer but did. And then ask yourself gently why it mattered. That why is the door. And if writing isn't your way, speak it aloud. Whisper it as you brush your teeth. Say it to the plants. Let it be informal. Let it be yours. One old monk used to carry stones in his robe pocket, 5 of them. Every time he touched one, he'd say a silent thank you for breath, for clarity, for someone else's smile. Not because life was always good, but because noticing the good made him more available to life. I wonder, what might your 5 stones be? When we begin to collect these moments of noticing, even just 1 or 2 a day, something shifts. Stress no longer feels like the whole picture. Sorrow no longer fills every frame. We begin to move from a life of scarcity to a life of sufficiency, and this doesn't mean denying hardship. Quite the opposite. Gratitude, in its truest form, exists right alongside grief. It says, yes, this hurts, and yet here is something beautiful too. So many of us carry the weight of years of disappointments and missed chances and quiet heartbreaks, and yet the fact that you're here listening, breathing, perhaps even smiling softly to yourself right now, that means something. That means you're still alive to notice. What you focus on grows. It's not just a phrase, it's a truth woven into the fabric of consciousness. And the more we choose to notice what softens us, the more our nervous system begins to trust the world again. You may not be able to control all that arrives at your doorstep, but you can choose how you greet it. And in doing so, you begin to reclaim a kind of agency, a kind of peace. So take a moment now, just one. What are you grateful for in this breath? Let it be small, let it be real, and from that small noticing, we'll carry forward into the next part of our journey. Because while stress and gratitude shape the mind, they also shape how we see ourselves in the story. And too often, we see ourselves as powerless, tossed around by life. But what if that's not true? What if learning how to navigate stress, is a skill, one you can still learn, no matter your age. Let's step into that next space together, where stress is no longer your master, but your teacher. If there's one belief that quietly saps our strength as we age, it's the whisper that says, it's too late to change. That voice creeps in unnoticed, like dust gathering on a shelf we no longer clean. And yet, nothing could be further from the truth. You see, learning to navigate stress, to reset our relationship with it, isn't a trait you either have or you don't. It's not a blessing handed to the lucky or the young. It is, like walking, like reading, like forgiveness, a skill. And the beautiful thing about skills is that they can be learned at any stage, by anyone willing to begin again. In the Buddhist tradition, there's a story of a man who came to the Buddha late in life. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, power, reputation, but inwardly he felt hollow. When he approached the Buddha and asked if it was too late for him to walk the path of peace, the Buddha looked at him with gentle eyes and replied, "The moment you turn toward the path is the moment you are already on it." That story has always struck me, not for its grandeur, but for its humility, because we all, at some point or another, need to begin again. We all need permission to be beginners in our own lives, especially when it comes to how we relate to the world's demands and our inner reactivity. You see, stress feels overwhelming, not just because life is busy, but because we often feel powerless in the face of it. The to-do lists, the illnesses, the strained relationships, they feel like tides we cannot stop, and so we give up before we even try. But learning to manage stress isn't about controlling the ocean. It's about learning how to float, how to swim gently in its currents without panicking, and that begins with presence. I once worked with a retired schoolteacher named James. He was the kind of man who had spent decades taking care of everyone but himself, students, his children, his aging parents. When he finally slowed down, he didn't feel peace, he felt lost. "My days are quiet now," he said, "but my mind isn't. It's loud in there." What we practiced together wasn't complicated. We didn't redesign his whole life. We didn't seek out grand solutions. Instead, we returned to the simple, the sacred ordinary. I invited him to notice one thing each day with full attention: the sound of the kettle, the sunlight on the table, the feel of the breeze on his skin during a morning walk. Not to analyze it, just to be with it. At first, it felt strange to him, too slow, too simple. But then, slowly, the silence began to feel less like emptiness and more like space. Spaciousness for breath, for clarity, for self-kindness. His mind didn't become perfectly still. It rarely does, but the noise wasn't in control anymore. And isn't that what we truly seek? Not the absence of stress, but the return of choice. And yes, the science now supports what monks have taught for millennia, that our nervous systems can be retrained. That neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new patterns, doesn't expire with age. In fact, many elders become better at integrating new emotional insights because they've lived long enough to know what truly matters. So if you've believed, even secretly, that it's too late for you, I offer you this truth. It's not. You are not too old, too fixed, too tired to learn a gentler way. The same way you once learned to walk, to write, to love, you can now learn how to rest your heart. But how, you might ask? Through small, repeatable rituals, not grand overhauls, not perfection, just practice, like breathing, not just when overwhelmed, but as a habit of grounding. One deep breath before answering the phone, one exhale before responding in a hard conversation, one pause before jumping to worry. Like noticing, one moment a day, what feels nourishing. Noticing without fixing. Noticing as a sacred act of honoring your own experience. Like naming gently what you feel. Not to judge it, but to give it space. This is fear. This is grief. This is tension in my shoulders. In Buddhist mindfulness, this is called naming the demon at the door. Once named, it loses its power, and perhaps most important, like forgiving yourself when you forget, because you will forget. We all do. That's not failure, that's the rhythm of returning. The truth is, the path to less stress and more resilience isn't linear. It doesn't move like a ladder, it moves like breath, in, out, forward, back, tightening, softening. It's not about always being calm, but about learning how to come home to calm more often. I invite you now to see yourself not as someone late to the game, but as someone arriving right on time with all the wisdom, the weariness and the wonder that your years have gifted you. You are not starting over, you are continuing, with more tenderness, with more intention, and as we hold this truth together, I want to invite you into one final reflection, one final movement inward, because all this learning, all this noticing and reframing and breathing points us towards something deeper, a shift from surviving stress to softening within it, from armor to openness, from gripping tightly to letting go. So come with me gently as we step into the final part of this journey, where we no longer measure strength by endurance, but by how softly we are willing to live. There's a moment, sometimes fleeting, sometimes still, when you realize you've been holding your breath for years, not always literally, but inwardly, holding tension in the jaw, holding your stomach in, holding back tears, holding up others, holding everything because someone had to. And in that realization comes a truth as simple as it is tender. You were never meant to carry it all alone. So many of us live as if life is a long hallway lined with doors, and behind each one is something we must manage, fix, explain, or control. But what if, just for now, you put down the keys? I once sat with a Buddhist teacher who told a story about a traveler who carried a heavy sack of stones. She climbed hills and crossed rivers, never setting the sack down. People would ask her why she carried it. "Because I always have," she'd reply. One day, she met a gentle monk who simply asked, "Do you need all of them?" She stopped, opened the sack, found it was filled with things she no longer recognized. Regrets, old guilt, expectations long outgrown. Quietly, she began placing them one by one along the road. The monk smiled. "You are not losing anything. You are remembering how to walk. That story is yours now too, if you want it, because you've walked long, through decades of doing and giving and surviving, and maybe it's time to loosen your grip, not because you're giving up, but because you're coming home to your breath, to your presence, to the quiet dignity of being, not what you produce, not what you fix, but simply who you are, beneath all the layers, beneath the story of what you were supposed to be." And maybe this is the gentlest truth of all. Life was never meant to be perfectly smooth. Not at 20, not at 60, not ever. The Buddhists speak of samsara, the wheel of life. Joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame. We don't escape the wheel. We learn to ride it with grace. We soften into its rhythm, and stress too will return. You will still forget to breathe, still worry, still say yes when you mean no, but now perhaps you will notice, sooner, with more kindness, and in that noticing there is choice, in that choice there is peace. I remember speaking with a man in his 80s, a former carpenter. His hands were worn, his spine curved like a question mark. He said, "All my life I thought I had to be solid like oak, strong, straight, unshakable, but these days," he smiled, "I like the idea of being like grass. I bend, I sway, I rise again." Isn't that a kind of strength too? The strength to soften, the courage to feel, the wisdom to rest. Because maybe resilience now isn't about bouncing back. Maybe it's about opening up. Maybe it's no longer about being the one who holds it all together, but the one who lets things fall into place on their own, without force. the one who trusts life to keep flowing even without constant effort. So take this breath as a threshold. Breathe in the life that is still here, even in the midst of loss or fatigue or unanswered questions. Breathe out the story that says you must be everything for everyone all the time. Breathe in the lightness of being. Breathe out what no longer fits, and ask yourself softly, without urgency, what am I ready to release? Not forever, not perfectly, just for today. Maybe it's the need to be right, or the guilt that was never truly yours. Maybe it's the fear that resting means wasting time, or the voice that says you haven't done enough. Whatever it is, place it down beside you. Let the earth hold it. It knows how. And now, as we close this journey, not with a solution, but a soft invitation, I leave you with this. You have walked far, you have given much, and still there is beauty waiting in the spaces where you allow yourself to be seen, not as the one who has it all figured out, but simply as a soul who is still learning how to live lightly. May your steps grow gentler with each passing day. May you find softness not only around you, but within you. May you remember again and again that rest is not a retreat, but a return. And if this message touched a quiet place within you, I invite you not to do anything grand, just to sit a little longer with your own breath, to watch the way it comes and goes without needing permission, to let that be enough for now. Until we meet again, may you walk gently through your days, carrying the quiet wisdom that has always lived within you.